Your ever true and faithful. Hercules. As far as it went, this intelligence was satisfactory. A kitanda, I know, is a kind of litter made of dry grass, protected by a curtain, and carried on the shoulders of two men by a long bamboo. What a relief to know that Mrs. Weldon and Jack have been spared the miseries of this dreadful march. May I not indulge the hope of seeing them at Kazund. 12th, the prisoners getting more and more weary and worn out. Bloodstains on the way still more conspicuous. Many poor wretches are a mass of wounds. One poor woman for 2 days has carried her dead child, from which she refuses to be parted. Smallpox raging, the road strewn with corpses. Still 10 days before we reach Kazund. Just past a tree from which slaves who had died from hunger were hanging by the neck. 18th, must not give in, but I am almost exhausted. Rains have ceased. We are to make what the dealers call treacherous, extra marches in the after part of the day. Road very steep, runs through nyasi, tall grass of which the stalks scratch my face, and the seeds get under my tattered clothes and make my skin smart painfully. My boots fortunately are thick and have not worn out. More slaves sick and abandoned to take their chance. Provisions running very short. Soldiers and pagazis must be satisfied, otherwise they desert. Consequently the slaves are all but starved. They can eat each other, say the agents. A young slave, apparently in good health, dropped down dead. It made me think of Livingstone's description of how free-born men, reduced to slavery, will suddenly press their hand on their side and die of a broken heart. Illustration: more slaves sick and abandoned to take their chance. 24th, 20 captives, incapable any longer of keeping pace with the rest, put to death by the havildars, the Arab chief offering no opposition. Poor old Nan, one of the victims of this horrible butchery. My foot struck her corpse as I passed, but I was not permitted to give her a decent burial. Poor old Nan, the first of the survivors of the Pilgrim to go to her long rest. Poor old Nan. Every night I watch for Dingo, but he never comes. Has Hercules nothing more to communicate, or has any mishap befallen him? If he is alive, he will do what mortal strength can do to aid us. Chapter 9. Kazund. By the 26th of May, when the caravan reached Kazund, the number of the slaves had diminished by more than half, so numerous had been the casualties along the road. But the dealers were quite prepared to make a market of their loss. The demand for slaves was very great, and the price must be raised accordingly. Angola at that time was the scene of a large Negro traffic, and as the caravans principally wended their way towards the interior, the Portuguese authorities at Londa and Benguela had practically no power to prevent it. The barracks on the shore were crowded to overflowing with prisoners, the few slave ships that managed to elude the cruisers being quite inadequate to embark the whole number for the Spanish colonies to America. Kazund, the point whence the caravans diverged to the various parts of the Lake District, is situated 3 miles from the mouth of the Konza, and is one of the most important lacunas, or markets of the province. The open marketplace where the slaves are exposed for sale is called the Chitoka. All the larger towns of Central Africa are divided into 2 distinct parts, one occupied by the Arab, Portuguese, or native merchants, and containing their slave barracks, the other being the residence of the Negro king, often a fierce drunken potentate, whose rule is a reign of terror, and who lives by subsidies allowed him by the traders. The commercial quarter of Kazund now belonged to. Illustration: adjoining the commercial quarter was the royal residence. José Antonio Alves. It was his largest depot, although he had another at Bih, and a third at Cassinge, where Cameron subsequently met him. It consisted of one long street, on each side of which were groups of flat-roofed houses called Thames, built of rough earth, and provided with square yards for cattle. The end of it opened into the Chitoka, which was surrounded by the barracks. Above the houses, some fine banyan trees waved their branches, surmounted here and there by the crests of graceful palms. There was at least a score of birds of prey that hovered about the streets, and came down to perform the office of public scavengers. At no great distance flowed the Luhai, a river not yet explored, but which is supposed to be an affluent or sub-affluent of the Congo. Adjoining the commercial quarter was the royal residence, nothing more nor less than a collection of dirty huts, extending over an area of nearly a square mile. Some of these huts were unenclosed, others were surrounded by a palisade of reeds or by a hedge of bushy figs. In an enclosure within a papyrus fence were about 30 huts appropriated to the king's slaves, another group for his wives, and in the middle, almost hidden by a plantation of manioc, a tembe larger and loftier than the rest, the abode of the monarch himself. He had sorely declined from the dignity and importance of his predecessors, and his army, which by the early Portuguese traders had been estimated at 20,000, now numbered less than 4,000 men. No longer could he afford, as in the good old time, to order a sacrifice of 25 or 30 slaves at one offering. His name was Moan Lunga. Little over 50, he was prematurely aged by drink and debauchery, and scarcely better than a maniac. His subjects, officers, and ministers were all liable to be mutilated at his pleasure, and noses and ears, feet and hands were cut off unsparingly whenever his caprice so willed it. His death would have been a cause of regret to no one, with the exception, perhaps, of Alves, who was on very good terms with him. Alves, moreover, feared that in the event of the present king's death, the succession of his chief wife, Queen Mona, might be disputed, and that his dominions would be invaded by a younger and more active neighbor, one of the kings of Ukusu, who had already seized upon some villages dependent on the government of Kazand, and who was in alliance with a rival trader named Tipo Tipo, a man of pure Arab extraction, from whom Cameron afterwards received a visit at Nyangwe. To all intents and purposes, Alves was the real sovereign of the district, having fostered the vices of the brutalized king till he had him completely in his power. He was a man considerably advanced in years. He was not, as his name might imply, a white man, but had merely assumed his Portuguese title for purposes of business. His true name was Kendall, and he was a pure Negro by birth, being a native of Dondo on the Konza. He had commenced life as a slave dealer's agent, and was now on his way towards becoming a first-class trader. That is to say, he was a consummate rascal under the guise of an honest man. He it was whom Cameron met at the end of 1874 at Kalmba, the capital of Urua, of which Kasongo is chief, and with whose caravan he traveled to Bih, a distance of 700 miles. It was midday when the caravan entered Kazand. The journey from the Konza had lasted 38 days, more than 5 weeks of misery as great as was within human power to endure. Amidst the noise of drums and kudu horns, the slaves were conducted to the marketplace. The soldiers of the caravan discharged their guns into the air, and old Alva's resident retinue responded with a similar salute. The bandits, than which the soldiers were nothing better, were delighted to meet again, and would celebrate their return by a season of riot and excess. The slaves, reduced to a total of about 250, were many of them almost dead from exhaustion. The forks were removed from their necks, though the chains were still retained, and the whole of them were driven into barracks that were unfit even for cattle, to await, in company with 1,200 to 1,500 other captives already there, the great market which would be held 2 days hence. The pagazis, after delivering their loads of ivory, would only stay to receive their payment of a few yards of calico or other stuff, and would then depart at once to join some other caravan. On being relieved from the forks which they had carried for so many weary days, Tom and his companions heartily wrung each other's hands, but they could not venture to utter one word of mutual encouragement. The 3 younger men, more full of life and vigor, had resisted the effects of the fatigue, but poor old Tom was nearly exhausted, and had the march been protracted for a few more days, he must have shared Nan's fate and been left behind, a prey to the wild beasts. Upon their arrival, all 4 were packed into a narrow cell, where some food was provided, and the door was immediately locked upon them. The Chitoka was now almost deserted, and Dick Sands was left there under the special charge of a havildar. He lost no opportunity of peering into every hut in the hope of catching a glimpse of Mrs. Weldon, who, if Hercules had not misinformed him, had come on hither just in front. But he was very much perplexed. He could well understand that Mrs. Weldon, if still a prisoner, would be kept out of sight, but why Negoro and Harris did not appear to triumph over him in his humiliation was quite a mystery to him. It was likely enough that the presence of either one or the other of them would be the signal for himself to be exposed to fresh indignity, or even to torture, but Dick would have welcomed the sight of them at Kazand, were it only as an indication that Mrs. Weldon and Jack were there also. It disappointed him, too, that Dingo did not come back. Ever since the dog had brought him the first note, he had kept an answer written ready to send to Hercules, imploring him to look after Mrs. Weldon and to keep him informed of everything. He began to fear that the faithful creature must be dead, perhaps perished in some attempt to reach himself. It was, however, quite possible that Hercules had taken the dog in some other direction, hoping to gain some depot in the interior. But so thoroughly had Dick persuaded himself that Mrs. Weldon had preceded him to Kazund that his disappointment became more and more keen when he failed to discover her. For a while he seemed to yield to despair, and sat down sorrowful and sick at heart. Suddenly, a chorus of voices and trumpets broke upon his ear. He was startled into taking a new interest in what was going on. "Alves, Alves," was the cry again and again repeated by the crowd. Here then was the great man himself about to appear. Was it not likely that Harris or Negoro might be with him? Dick stood erect and resolute, his eye vivid with expectation. He felt all eagerness to stand face to face with his betrayers. Boy as he was equal to cope with them both. The kitanda, which came in sight at the end of the street, was nothing more than a kind of hammock covered by a faded and ragged curtain. An old Negro stepped out of it. His attendants greeted him with noisy acclamations. This then was the great trader, José Antonio Alves. Immediately following him was his friend Coimbra, son of the chief Coimbra of Bis, and according to Cameron, the greatest blackguard in the province. This sworn ally of Alves, this organizer of his slave raids, this commander worthy of his own horde of bandits, was utterly loathsome in his appearance. His flesh was filthily dirty, his eyes were bloodshot, his skin yellow, and his long hair all disheveled. He had no other attire than a tattered shirt, a tunic made of grass, and a battered straw hat, under which his countenance appeared like that of some old hag. Alves himself, whose clothes were like those of an old Turk the day after a carnival, was 1 degree more respectable in appearance than his satellite, not that his looks spoke much for the very highest class of African slave dealers. To Dick's great disappointment, neither Harris nor Negoro was among his retinue. Both Alves and Coimbra shook hands with Ibn Hamish, the leader of the caravan, and congratulated him on the success of the expedition. Alves made a grimace on being told that half the slaves had died on the way, but on the whole he seemed satisfied. He could meet the demand that at present existed, and would lose no time in bartering the new arrival for ivory or hannas, copper in the shape of a St. Andrew's cross, the form in which the metal is exported in Central Africa. After complimenting the havildars upon the way in which they had done their work, the trader gave orders that the porters should be paid and dismissed. The conversations were carried on in a mixture of Portuguese and native idioms, in which the African element abounded so largely that a native of Lisbon would have been at a loss to understand them. Dick, of course, could not comprehend what was said, and it was only when he saw a havildar go towards the cell in which Tom and the others were confined that he realized that the talk was about himself and his party. When the Negroes were brought out, Dick came close up, being anxious to learn as much as he could of what was in contemplation. The old trader's eyes seemed to brighten as he glanced upon the 3 strapping young men who, he knew, would soon be restored to their full strength by rest and proper food. They at least would get a good price. As for poor old Tom, he was manifestly so broken down by infirmity and age that he would have no value in the market. In a few words of broken English, which Alves had picked up from some of his agents, he ironically gave them all a welcome. "Glad to see you," he said with a diabolical grin. Tom knew what he meant, and drew himself up proudly. "We are free men," he protested, "free citizens of the United States." "Yes, yes," replied Alves, grinning, "you are Americans, very glad to see you." "Very glad to see you," echoed Coimbra, and walking up to Austin, he felt his chest and shoulders, and then proceeded to open his mouth in order to examine his teeth. A blow from Austin's powerful fist sent the satellite staggering backwards. Some soldiers made a dash and seized the young Negro, evidently ready to make him pay dearly for his temerity, but Alves was by no means willing to have any injury done to his newly acquired property, and called them off. He hardly attempted to conceal his amusement at Coimbra's discomfiture, although the blow had cost him one of his front teeth. After he had recovered somewhat from the shock, Coimbra stood scowling at Austin, as if mentally vowing vengeance on some future occasion. Dick Sands was now himself brought forward in the custody of a havildar. It was clear that Alves had been told all about him, for after scanning him for a moment, he stammered out in his broken English. The little Yankee." "Yes," replied Dick, I see you know who I am. What are you going to do with me and my friends?" "Yankee, little Yankee," repeated the trader, who either did not or would not comprehend the meaning of Dick's question. Dick turned to Coimbra and made the same inquiry of him. In spite of his degraded features, now still farther disfigured by being swollen from the blow, it was easy to recognize that he was not of native origin. He refused to answer a word, and only stared again with the vicious glare of malevolence. Meanwhile, Alves had begun to talk to Ibn Hamish. Dick felt sure that they intended to separate him from the Negroes, and accordingly took the opportunity of whispering a few words to them. "My friends, I have heard from Hercules. Dingo." Illustration. With a yell and a curse, the American fell dead at his feet. "Brought me a note from him, tied round his neck. He says Harris and Negoro have carried off Mrs. Weldon, Jack, and Mr. Benedict. He did not know where. Have patience, and we will find them yet." "And where's Nan?" muttered Tom in a low voice. "Dead," replied Dick, and was about to add more, when a hand was laid upon his shoulder, and a voice that he knew too well exclaimed, "Well, my young friend, how are you? I am glad to see you again." He turned round quickly. Harris stood before him. "Where is Mrs. Weldon?" asked Dick impetuously. "Ah, poor thing," answered Harris with an air of deep commiseration. "What, is she dead?" Dick almost shrieked. "Where is her child?" "Poor little fellow," said Harris in the same mournful tone. These insinuations, that those in whose welfare he was so deeply interested had succumbed to the hardships of the journey, awoke in Dick's mind a sudden and irresistible desire for vengeance. Darting forwards, he seized the cutlass that Harris wore in his belt and plunged it into his heart. With a yell and a curse, the American fell dead at his feet. Chapter 10. Market Day. So sudden was Dick's action that it had been impossible to parry his blow. Several of the natives rushed on him, and in all likelihood would have struck him down upon the spot had not Negoro arrived at that very moment. At a sign from him, the natives drew back, and proceeded to raise and carry away Harris's corpse. Alves and Coimbra were urgent in their demand that Dick should forthwith be punished by death, but Negoro whispered to them that they would assuredly be the gainers by delay, and they accordingly contented themselves with ordering the youth to be placed under strict supervision. This was the first time that Dick had set eyes upon Negoro since he had left the coast. Nevertheless, so heartbroken was he at the intelligence he had just received, that he did not deign to address a word to the man whom he knew to be the real author of all his misery. He cared not now what became of him. Loaded with chains, he was placed in the dungeon where Alves was accustomed to confine slaves who had been condemned to death for mutiny or violence. That he had no communication with the outer world gave him no concern. He had avenged the death of those for whose safety he had felt himself responsible, and could now calmly await the fate which he could not doubt was in store for him. He did not dare to suppose that he had been temporarily spared otherwise than that he might. Illustration. Accompanied by Coimbra, Alves himself was one of the first arrivals. Suffer the cruelest tortures that native ingenuity could devise. That the Pilgrim's cook now held in his power, the boy captain he so thoroughly hated, was warned enough that the sternest possible measure of vengeance would be exacted. 2 days later, the great market, the Laconie, commenced. Although many of the principal traders were there from the interior, it was by no means exclusively a slave mart. A considerable proportion of the natives from the neighboring provinces assembled to dispose of the various products of the country. Quite early, the great Chitoka of Kazund was all alive with a bustling concourse of little under 5,000 people, including the slaves of old Alves, amongst whom were Tom and his 3 partners in adversity, an item by no means inconsiderable in the dealer's stock. Accompanied by Coimbra, Alves himself was one of the first arrivals. He was going to sell his slaves in lots to be conveyed in caravans into the interior. The dealers, for the most part, consisted of half-breeds from Ujiji, the principal market on Lake Tanganyika, whilst some of a superior class were manifestly Arabs. The natives that were assembled were of both sexes, and of every variety of age, the women in particular displaying an aptitude in making bargains that is shared by their sisters elsewhere of a lighter hue. And it may be said that no market of the most civilized region could be characterized by greater excitement or animation, for amongst the savages of Africa, the customer makes his offer in equally noisy terms as the vendor. The Laconie was always considered a kind of fete day. Consequently, the natives of both sexes, though their clothing was scanty in extent, made a point of appearing in a most lavish display of ornaments. Their headgear was most remarkable. The men had their hair arranged in every variety of eccentric device. Some had it divided into 4 parts, rolled over cushions, and fastened into a chignon, or mounted in front into a bunch of tails adorned with red feathers. Others plastered it thickly with a mixture of red mud and oil similar to that used for greasing machinery, and formed it into cones or lumps, into which they inserted a medley of iron pins and ivory skewers, whilst the greatest dandies had a glass bead threaded upon every single hair, the whole being fastened together by a tattooing knife driven through the glittering mass. As a general rule, the women preferred dressing their hair in little tufts about the size of a cherry, arranging it into the shape of a cap, with corkscrew ringlets on each side of the face. Some wore it simply hanging down their backs, others in French fashion, with a fringe across the forehead. But every coiffure, without exception, was daubed and caked either with the mixture of mud and grease, or with a bright red extract of sandalwood called encola. But it was not only on their heads that they made this extraordinary display of ornaments. The lobes of their ears were loaded till they reached their shoulders with a profusion of wooden pegs, openwork copper rings, grains of maize, or little gourds, which served the purpose of snuff boxes. Their necks, arms, wrists, legs, and ankles were a perfect mass of brass and copper. Rings, or sometimes were covered with a lot of bright buttons. Rows of red beads, called sames or talakas, seemed also very popular. As they had no pockets, they attached their knives, pipes, and other articles to various parts of their body, so that altogether, in their holiday attire, the rich men of the district might not inappropriately be compared to walking shrines. With their teeth they had all played the strangest of vagaries. The upper and lower incisors had generally been extracted, and the others had been filed to points or carved into hooks, like the fangs of a rattlesnake. Their fingernails were allowed to grow to such an immoderate length as to render the hands well-nigh useless, and their swarthy skins were tattooed with figures of trees, birds, crescents, and discs, or, not unfrequently, with those zigzag lines which Livingstone thinks he recognizes as resembling those observed in ancient Egyptian drawings. The tattooing is effected by means of a blue substance, inserted into incisions previously made in the skin. Every child is tattooed in precisely the same pattern as his father before him, and thus it may always be ascertained to what family he belongs. Instead of carrying his armorial bearings upon his plate, or upon the panels of his carriage, the African magnate wears them emblazoned on his own bosom. The garments that were usually worn were simply aprons of antelope skins descending to the knees, but occasionally a short petticoat might be seen made of woven grass and dyed with bright colors. The ladies not unfrequently wore girdles of beads attached to green skirts embroidered with silk and ornamented with bits of glass or cowries, or sometimes the skirts were made of the grass cloth called lambda, which in blue, yellow, or black is so much valued by the people of Zanzibar. Garments of these pretensions, however, always indicated that the wearers belonged to the upper classes. The lower orders, such as the smaller dealers as well as the slaves, had hardly any clothes at all. The women commonly acted as porters, and arrived at the market with huge baskets on their backs, which they secured by means of straps passed across the forehead. Having deposited their loads upon the chitoka, they turned out their goods, and then seated themselves inside the empty baskets. As the result of the extreme fertility of the country, all the articles offered for sale were of a first-rate quality. There were large stores of rice, which had been grown at a profit 100 times as great as the cost, and maize which, producing 3 crops in 8 months, yielded a profit as large again as the rice. There were also sesame, urua pepper stronger than cayenne, manioc, nutmegs, salt, and palm oil. In the market, too, were hundreds of goats, pigs, and sheep, evidently of a Tartar breed, with hair instead of wool, and there was a good supply of fish and poultry. Besides all these, there was an attractive display of bright-colored pottery, the designs of which were very symmetrical. In shrill, squeaky voices, children were crying several varieties of native drinks: banana wine, pombe, which, whatever it was, seemed to be in great demand; malafu, a kind of beer compounded of bananas, and mead, a mixture of honey and water fermented with malt. But the most prominent feature in the whole market was the traffic in stuffs and ivory. The pieces could be counted by thousands of the unbleached macracani from Salem in Massachusetts, of the blue cotton, kanaki, 34 inches wide, and of the checked sohari, blue and black with its scarlet border. More expensive than these were lots of silk dealies, with red, green, or yellow grounds, which are sold in lengths of 3 yards, at prices varying from $7 to $80 when they are interwoven with gold. The ivory had come from well-nigh every part of Central Africa and was destined for Khartoum, Zanzibar, and Natal, many of the merchants dealing in this commodity exclusively. How vast a number of elephants must be slaughtered to supply this ivory may be imagined when it is remembered that over 200 tons, that is, 1,125,000 pounds, are exported annually to Europe. Of this, much the larger share goes to England, where the Sheffield cutlery consumes about 382,500 pounds. From the west coast of Africa alone, the produce is nearly 140 tons. The average weight of a pair of tusks is 28 pounds, and the ordinary value of these in 1874 would be about 60 L. But here in Kazund were some weighing no less than 165 pounds. Of that soft, translucent quality which retains its whiteness far better than the ivory from other sources. As already mentioned, slaves are not unfrequently used as current money amongst the African traders, but the natives themselves usually pay for their goods with Venetian glass beads, of which the chalk-white are called cachokolos, the black bubulus, and the red sikandereches. Strung in 10 rows or keets, these beads are twisted twice round the neck, forming what is called a fundo, which is always reckoned of considerable value. The usual measure by which they are sold is the fracilla, containing a weight of about 70 pounds. Livingstone, Cameron, and Stanley always took care to be well provided with this kind of currency. In default of beads, the pice, a Zanzibar coin worth something more than a farthing, and vianguas, shells peculiar to the East Coast, are recognized as a medium of exchange in the market. Amongst the cannibal tribes, a certain value is attached to human teeth, and at the Laconie some natives might be seen wearing strings of teeth, the owners of which they had probably, at some previous time, devoured. This species of currency, however, was falling rapidly into disuse. Towards the middle of the day, the excitement of the market reached its highest pitch, and the uproar became perfectly deafening. The voices of the eager sellers mingled with those of indignant and overcharged customers. Fights were numerous, and as there was an utter absence of any kind of police, no effort was made to restore peace or order amongst the unruly crowd. It was just noon when Alves gave orders that the slaves he wished to dispose of should be placed on view. Thereupon nearly 2,000 unfortunates were brought forward, many of whom had been confined in the dealer's barracks for several months. Most of the stock, however, had been so carefully attended to that they were in good condition, and it was only the last batch that looked as if they would be improved by another month's rest. But as the demand upon the East Coast was now very large, Alves hoped to get a good price for all, and determined to part with even the last arrivals for whatever sum he could obtain. Amongst these latter, whom the havildars drove like a herd of cattle into the middle of the chitoka, were Tom and his 3 friends. They were closely chained, and rage and shame were depicted in their countenances. Bat passed a quick and scrutinizing gaze around him, and said to the others, "I do not see Mr. Dick." Tom answered mournfully, "Mr. Dick will be killed, if he is not dead already. Our only hope is that we may now all be bought in one lot. It will be a consolation to us if we can be all together." Tears rose to Bat's eyes as he thought of how his poor old father was likely to be sold, and carried away to wear out his days as a common slave. The sale now commenced. The agents of Alves proceeded to divide the slaves, men, women, and children, into lots, treating them in no respect better than beasts in a cattle market. Tom and the others were paraded about from customer to customer, an agent accompanying them to proclaim the price demanded. Strong, intelligent-looking Americans, quite different to the miserable creatures brought from the banks of the Zambesi and Lualaba, they at once attracted the observation of the Arab and half-breed dealers. Just as though they were examining a horse, the buyers felt their limbs, turned them round and round, looked at their teeth, and finally tested their paces by throwing a stick to a distance and making them run to fetch it. All the slaves were subjected to similar humiliations, and ale alike, except the very young children, seemed deeply sensible of their degradation. The cruelty exhibited towards them was very vile. Coimbra, who was half drunk, treated them with the utmost brutality, not that they had any reason to expect any gentler dealings at the hands of the new masters who might purchase them for ivory or any other commodity. Children were torn away from their parents, husbands from their wives, brothers from sisters, and without even the indulgence of a parting word, were separated never to meet again. The scenes that occur at such markets, as this at Kazund, are too heartrending to be described in detail. It is one of the peculiar requirements of the slave trade that the two sexes should have an entirely different destination. In fact, the dealers who purchase men never purchase women. The women, who are required to supply the Mussulman harems, are sent principally to Arab districts to be exchanged for ivory, whilst the men, who are to be put to hard labor, are dispatched to the coast, east and west, whence they are exported to the Spanish colonies, or to the markets of Muscat or Madagascar. To Tom and his friends, the prospect of being transported to a slave colony was far better than that of being retained in some Central African province, where they could have no chance of regaining their liberty, and the moment, to them, was accordingly one of great suspense. Altogether, things turned out for them better than they dared anticipate. They had at least the satisfaction of finding that as yet they were not to be separated. Alves, of course, had taken good care to conceal the origin of this exceptional lot, and their own ignorance of the language thoroughly prevented them from communicating it. But the anxiety to secure so valuable a property rendered the competition for it very keen. The bidding rose higher and higher, until at length the four men were knocked down to a rich Arab dealer, who purposed in the course of a few days to take them to Lake Tanganyika, and thence to one of the diptos of Zanzibar. This journey, it is true, would be for 1,500 miles across the most unhealthy parts of Central Africa, through districts harassed by internal wars, and it seemed improbable that Tom could survive the hardships he must meet. Like poor old Nan, he would succumb to fatigue. But the brave fellows did not suffer themselves to fear the future, they were only too happy to be still together, and the chain that bound them one to another was felt to be easier and lighter to bear. Their new master knew that it was for his own interest that his purchase should be well taken care of. He looked to make a substantial profit at Zanzibar, and sent them off at once to his own private barracks. Consequently, they saw no more of what transpired at Kazund. Chapter 11. A Bowl of Punch. The afternoon was passing away, and it was now past 4 o'clock, when the sound of drums, cymbals, and a variety of native instruments was heard at the end of the main thoroughfare. The market was still going on with the same animation as before. Half a day's screeching and fighting seemed neither to have wearied the voices nor broken the limbs of the demoniacal traffickers. There was a considerable number of slaves still to be disposed of, and the dealers were haggling over the remaining lots, with an excitement of which a sudden panic on the London Stock Exchange could give a very inadequate conception. But the discordant concert which suddenly broke upon the ear was the signal for business to be at once suspended. The crowd might cease its uproar and recover its breath. The king of Kazund, Mon Lunga, was about to honor the Laconie with a visit. Attended by a large retinue of wives, officers, soldiers, and slaves, the monarch was conveyed to the middle of the marketplace in an old palanquin, from which he was obliged to have 5 or 6 people to help him to descend. Alves and the other traders advanced to meet him with the most exaggerated gestures of reverence, all of which he received as his rightful homage. He was a man of 50 years of age, but might easily have passed for 80. He looked like an old, decrepit monkey. On his head was a kind of tiara, adorned with leopard's claws dyed red, and tufts of grayish-white hair. Illustration: the potentate beneath whose sway the country trembled for 100 miles round. This was the usual crown of the sovereigns of Kazund. From his waist hung 2 skirts of kudu hide, stiff as blacksmith's aprons, and embroidered with pearls. The tattooings on his breast were so numerous that his pedigree, which they declared, might seem to reach back to time immemorial. His wrists and arms were encased in copper bracelets, thickly encrusted with beads. He wore a pair of top boots, a present from Alves some 20 years ago. In his left hand he carried a great stick surmounted by a silver knob, in his right a fly-flapper, with a handle studded with pearls. Over his head was carried an old umbrella with as many patches as a harlequin's coat, whilst from his neck hung Cousin Benedict's magnifying glass, and on his nose were the spectacles which had been stolen from Bat's pocket. Such was the appearance of the potentate beneath, whose sway the country trembled for 100 miles round. By virtue of his sovereignty Lunga claimed to be of celestial origin, and any subject who should have the audacity to raise a question on this point would have been dispatched forthwith to another world. All his actions, his eating and drinking, were supposed to be performed by divine impulse. He certainly drank like no other mortal. His officers and ministers, confirmed tipplers as they were, appeared sober men in comparison with himself, and he seemed never to be doing anything but imbibing strong pombe, an overproof spirit with which Alves kept him liberally supplied. In his harem Lunga had wives of all ages from 40 to 14, most of whom accompanied him on his visit to the Laconie. Mona, the chief wife, who was called the queen, was the eldest of them all, and like the rest, was of royal blood. She was a vixenish-looking woman, very gaily attired. She wore a kind of bright tartan over a skirt of woven grass, embroidered with pearls. Round her throat was a profusion of necklaces, and her hair was mounted up in tiers that toppled high above her head, making her resemble some hideous monster. The younger wives, all of them sisters or cousins of the king, were less elaborately dressed. They walked behind her, ready at the slightest sign to perform the most menial services. Did His Majesty wish to sit down, two of them would immediately stoop to the ground and form a seat with their bodies, whilst others would have to lie down and support his feet upon their backs, a throne and footstool of living ebony. Amidst the staggering, half-tipsy crowd of ministers, officers, and magicians that composed Lunga's suite, there was hardly a man to be seen who had not lost either an eye, an ear, or hand, or nose. Death and mutilation were the only two punishments practiced in Kazand, and the slightest offense involved the instant amputation of some member of the body. The loss of the ear was considered the severest penalty, as it prevented the possibility of wearing earrings. The governors of districts, or kililos, whether hereditary or appointed for 4 years, were distinguished by red waistcoats and zebraskin caps. In their hands they brandished long rattans, coated at one extremity with a varnish of magic drugs. The weapons carried by the soldiers consisted of wooden bows adorned with fringes and provided with a spare bowstring, knives filed into the shape of serpents' tongues, long, broad lances, and shields of palm wood, ornamented with arabesques. In the matter of uniform, the royal army had no demands to make upon the royal treasury. Amongst the attendants of the king, there was a considerable number of sorcerers and musicians. The sorcerers, or mganga, were practically the physicians of the court, the savages having the most implicit faith in divinations and incantations of every kind, and employing fetishes, clay or wooden figures, representing sometimes ordinary human beings and sometimes fantastic animals. Like the rest of the retinue, these magicians were, for the most part, more or less mutilated, an indication that some of their prescriptions on behalf of the king had failed of success. The musicians were of both sexes, some performing on illustration. Alves advanced and presented the king with some fresh tobacco. Shrill rattles, some on huge drums, whilst others played on instruments called marimbas, a kind of dulcimer made of 2 rows of different-sized gourds fastened in a frame, and struck by sticks with india-rubber balls at the end. To any but native ears, the music was perfectly deafening. Several flags and banners were carried the procession, and amongst these was mixed up a number of long pikes, upon which were stuck the skulls of the various chiefs that Lunga had conquered in battle. As the king helped out of his palanquin, the acclamations rose higher and higher from every quarter of the marketplace. The soldiers attached to the caravans fired off their old guns, though the reports were almost too feeble to be heard above the noisy vociferations of the crowd, and the havildars rubbed their black noses with cinnabar powder, which they carried in bags, and prostrated themselves. Alves advanced and presented the king with some fresh tobacco, the appeasing herb, as it is called in the native dialect, and certainly Lunga seemed to require some appeasing, as, for some unknown reason, he was in a thoroughly bad temper. Coimbra, Ibn Hamish, and the dealers all came forward to pay their court to the monarch, the Arabs greeting him with the cry of marhaba, or welcome. Others clapped their hands and bowed to the very ground, while some even smeared themselves with mud, in token of their most servile subjection. But Lunga scarcely took notice of any of them. He went staggering along, rolling like a ship upon a stormy sea, and made his way past the crowds of slaves, each of whom, no less than their masters, trembled lest he should think fit to claim them for his own. Negoro, who kept close at Alva's side, did not fail to render his homage along with the rest. Alves and the king were carrying on a conversation in the native language, if that could be called a conversation, in which Moan Lunga merely jerked out a few monosyllables from his inflamed and swollen lips. He was asking Alves to replenish his stock of brandy. "We are proud to welcome your majesty at the market of Kazund," Alves was saying. "Get me brandy," was all the drunken king's reply. "Will it please your majesty to take part in the business of the Laconie?" Alves tried to ask. "Drink," blurted out the king impatiently. Alves continued. "My friend Negoro here is anxious to greet your majesty after his long absence." "Drink," roared the monarch again. "Will the king take pombe or mead?" asked Alves, at last obliged to take notice of the demand. "Brandy, give me fire water," yelled the king in a fury, "for every drop you shall have." "A drop of a white man's blood," suggested Negoro, glancing at Alves. "Yes, yes, kill a white man," assented Moan Lunga, his ferocious instincts all aroused by the proposition. "There is a white man here," said Alves, "who has killed my agent. He must be punished for his act." "Send him to King Mesongo," cried the king. "Mesongo and the Asuas will cut him up and eat him alive." Only too true it is that cannibalism is still openly practiced in certain provinces of Central Africa. Livingstone records that the Manyumas not only eat men killed in war, but even buy slaves for that purpose. It is said to be the avowal of these Manyumas that human flesh is slightly salt and requires no seasoning. Cameron relates how in the dominions of Moan Buga dead bodies were soaked for a few days in running water as a preparation for their being devoured. And Stanley found traces of a widely spread cannibalism amongst the inhabitants of Yukusu. But however horrible might be the manner of death proposed by Moan Lunga, it did not at all suit Negoro's purpose to let Dick Sands out of his clutches. "The white man is here," he said to the king. "It is here he has committed his offense, and here he should be punished." "If you will," replied Moan Lunga. "Only I must have fire water, a drop of fire water for every drop of the white man's blood." "Yes, you shall have the fire water," assented Alves. "And what is more, you shall have it all alight. We will give your majesty a bowl of blazing punch." The thought had struck Alves, and he was himself delighted with the idea that he would set the spirit in flames. Moan Lunga had complained that the fire water did not justify its name as it ought, and Alves hoped that perhaps, administered in this new form, it might revivify the deadened membranes of the palate of the king. Moan Lunga did not conceal his satisfaction. Wives and courtiers alike were full of anticipation. They had all drunk brandy, but they had not drunk brandy alight. And not only was their thirst for alcohol to be satisfied, their thirst for blood was likewise to be indulged. And when it is remembered how, even amongst the civilized, drunkenness reduces a man below the level of a brute, it may be imagined to what barbarous cruelties Dick Sands was likely to be exposed. The idea of torturing a white man was not altogether repugnant to the colored blood of either Alves or Coimbra, while with Negoro, the spirit of vengeance had completely overpowered all feeling of compunction. Night, without any intervening twilight, was soon drawing on, and the contemplated display could hardly fail to be effective. The program for the evening consisted of two parts: first, the blazing punch bowl, then the torture, culminating in an execution. The destined victim was still closely confined in his dark and dreary dungeon. All the slaves, whether sold or not, had been driven back to the barracks, and the Chitoka was cleared of everyone except the slave dealers, the havildars and the soldiers, who hoped, by favor of the king, to have a share of the flaming punch.